As a health practitioner, patient safety is paramount, no matter what title you work under, and being fit to practice as a practitioner is an important aspect in maintaining patient safety. The Australian Health Practitioner Regulation Agency, or AHPRA, is a governing agency for 16 professional boards nationwide, including paramedicine. Each of these professions are protected under AHPRA, meaning only those registered into the profession may practice under that professional title, protecting patients from receiving care from those who do not meet the national standards. AHPRA has set out 5 core standards for all professionals that the practitioner must meet to become registered. Once registered, the health practitioner must continually maintain these 5 standards to be considered fit to practice. These standards are based upon the Health Practitioners Regulation National Law Act. A notification is a concern reported to AHPRA from a member of the public or another health practitioner regarding the registered professional's ability to practice. This can result in a range of actions including investigations, assessments, and hearings to determine the practitioner's ability to uphold the national standards and practice in a manner keeping patient safety paramount. To explore the role of a professional governing body, like AHPRA, and the actions that may arise from a notification, let's look at the case of Mr. Andrew Davies.
9 minutes, 540 seconds. That is how long Mr. Davies observed as patient A suffered from cardiac arrest. At the time, Mr. Davies was not aware patient A was in cardiac arrest. How could he be? For he did nothing but watch as patient A collapsed onto the road. Mr. Davies' student was concerned for patient A. However, Mr. Davies told her to remain in the ambulance as the patient was fine. Mr. Davies felt he had no obligation to patient A as he was originally brought to the hospital by colleague C. After the collapse, colleague C stood over patient A and spoke for a couple of minutes before walking away, leaving him lying on the road. Mr. Davies witnessed this and, despite concerns from his student, decided to do nothing. Patient A died as a result of the negligence of a number of medical professionals, including Mr. Davies.
When addressing Mr. Davies' performance during the incident in question, to determine whether he is fit to practice, it is necessary to establish whether his actions were negligent. Common law derived from Lawn and Anor v. Wood and Anor dictates that health professionals in physical or circumstantial proximity to a person in peril must render assistance where it is reasonable to do so. Furthermore, from the case of Donahue v. Stevenson came the neighbour principle. Consequently, due to Mr. Davies' physical proximity and the fact that it was reasonably foreseeable that his omissions were likely to harm the patient, a duty of care was in fact established. Roger v. Whitaker explained that health professionals carry a duty to exercise reasonable care and skill. It is unquestionable that by failing to provide his knowledge and skill, despite the dire clinical situation, Mr. Davies' actions breached the standard of care required and expected of a paramedic. Furthermore, this breach in standard of care likely contributed to the fatal outcomes of the patient's cardiac arrest. This is proven using the but-for test. The extent of the physical damages experienced by the patient would have been mitigated but for the negligence of Mr. Davies. This is evidenced by the principle that early recognition and defibrillation in cardiac arrest leads to better patient outcomes. Lastly, by failing to render assistance to the patient who he witnessed collapse on 2 occasions in 6 to 9 minutes, it was reasonably foreseeable that on the balance of probabilities, the patient would suffer physical damage.
Mr. Davies neglecting to deliver treatment to the patient will impose negative connotations on the Ambulance Service and is therefore consistent with misconduct, as depicted in the Ambulance Service Act below, as his omission to not treat the collapsed patient reflects seriously and adversely on the Ambulance Service and therefore breaches legislation. Additionally, Mr. Davies breaches the Code of Conduct by not making the patient his first concern, but rather is more concerned about himself. Due to Mr. Davies' actions, it is appropriate to ascertain that ethical egoism plays an important part in his decision-making.
Who the fork is that?
Ethical egoism is a theory holding that actions are only partaken in if they promote one's self-interest and benefit. Furthermore, no assistance was offered by Mr. Davies as there was likely to be no benefit on his behalf. The bioethical framework as presented shows non-maleficence as a pillar in decision-making, and in the context of Mr. Davies, he refuses to protect the patient from harm by not treating them. He then justifies his omission to treat the patient by saying that it had nothing to do with him, and therefore depicting not only ethical egoism, but also non-maleficence on Mr. Davies' behalf.
How was kind of cool. Ethically speaking.
The AHPRA Paramedicine Board of Australia Code of Conduct states that good practice in relation to risk management involves taking all reasonable steps to address the issue if there is reason to think that the safety of patients or clients may be compromised. Therefore, as Mr. Andrew Davies did not leave the ambulance to help the patient and act within his duty of care when the patient was clearly compromised, he did not act within the expected practice of a paramedic as per the AHPRA Code of Conduct, thereby demonstrating misconduct. A Performance and Professional Standards Panel is a hearing held to assess a practitioner's fitness to practice after alleged misconduct or unsatisfactory performance to protect and maintain patient safety. Mr. Davies would be subject to a Performance and Professional Standards Panel as his actions on June 23, 2012 demonstrated unsatisfactory practice and misconduct, resulting in impaired patient safety. It is at this panel hearing that it can be decided Mr. Davies' actions did not fall below the national standards, resulting in cancellation of his registration. We believe Mr. Andrew Davies' fitness to practice is impaired, as evident by his negligence, professional misconduct, and breach of his professional responsibility. According to the AHPRA Paramedicine Board of Australia Code of Conduct, practitioners have a duty to make the care of patients or clients their first concern and to practice safely and effectively. Mr. Andrew Davies' actions were inconsistent with the Code of Conduct and therefore a risk to patient safety. Due to the recent inclusion of paramedicine registration in Queensland, it is imperative that laws and regulations regarding paramedic practice are upheld in order to ensure patient safety and paramedic credibility. Therefore, if a paramedic's fitness to practice is recognised as impaired, for example as seen in the case of Mr. Andrew Davies, action should be taken to eliminate the possibility of recurrence, so to ensure patient safety and maintain the public's confidence in the Queensland Ambulance Service.